Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365 where I demystify Microsoft solutions for the MSP space. In today's video, I'll be covering a high-level introduction into Microsoft's Endpoint Manager, better known as Intune for a lot of you in this space. I have done videos on this in the past, but it's been a couple of years now since I did the introduction, and Microsoft's really changed the portal a lot, so I want to do a refresher and also just provide best practices for you as well if you're just getting started. If you haven't been exposed to Intune or not using it today, I highly implore you to start doing some research and start enrolling devices into the service. It's my fundamental belief that Intune and other MDM providers will displace RMM tools in the next 5 years. I think that's evident by some of the things that have been happening in the market recently, like SolarWinds partnering with Intune and Microsoft creating a multi-tenant level management solution for Intune called Lighthouse. In addition to that, Intune already does a lot of what our RMM tools do today, like patch management, app deployment, the configuration of profiles. This is all available, but not necessarily scalable today just because we have to deal with a single tenant at a time. So I keep all of that in mind and really take the action items I gave you at the end of the call to pursue some of the things that I consider to be best practices when onboarding. Before I get into today's video, if you do want to see more content around Microsoft 365 and the MSP space, be sure to subscribe. So I'm here with a particular Endpoint Manager admin center with a tenant that has Microsoft 365 Business Premium. I would recommend that you use one of the bundled offerings that includes Intune like Business Premium or EMS plus E3 because it comes with Azure AD P1, which enhances your experience here with everything that you can do with conditional access and hybrid join and all of that. So I would just want you to have the best licensing combos there. I'm going to be bucketizing some of these features just so it's a little bit more comprehensive in this video. And right now, we'll go ahead and start with some of the basic administration that you would do and what I do as far as best practices whenever I onboard a new tenant. So coming under Tenant Administration, I will go ahead and click on Customization. This is where you can add the company logo and branding so that whenever you do start to enroll devices or users are enrolling into Intune, they have that familiar branding, whether that's through an autopilot experience when they first boot up the device, or if it's through a company portal app, or if it's on their mobile device through the company portal app. It doesn't matter. You get that consistent experience that knows that, hey, this is my company. I'm getting a familiar exposure to rolling this device into their corporate policy and all of that. So the next thing here is terms and conditions. This is something that I would include if you plan on allowing for BYOD devices to be joined. If a device is marked as corporate, and you'll see some of this in the enrollment process, it may not be as important, but when you think about users enrolling their personal devices to your service, you want to have some terms, some T's and C's to basically protect you and say something along the lines of, hey, we're going to have access to certain data. We have the ability to wipe that data at any point in time just to protect ourselves in light of a lost or stolen device. So that's something that they can accept before fully enrolling that personal or BYOD device as well. And those are really a couple of things that I want to mention here. If you are a large organization looking to stratify roles within this portal, I would check this out for a true model of least privilege when you think about read-only capabilities in here versus writing policies and deleting devices and things of that nature. So that may be one thing that you want to check out. The next section here, after we get through some of that side of the house in the sense of administration, is under the devices section. So when you click on enroll devices here, there's a couple of things from a policy configuration standpoint that you want to do. So under automatic enrollment, I believe this is set by default now, but you want to start off with MDM scope to all and MAM scope to none. So MAM is mobile application management. This is one of the powerful things of Intune in that you don't necessarily have to support and manage all the devices that are touching corporate data to still be in a secure and compliant fashion with any policy that you might think of. So MAM policies do allow you to basically separate out corporate versus personal data on certain applications, but it also allows you to put some protection on that corporate data, like not being able to cut, copy, paste, or not being able to save as to untrusted or unmanaged locations on their computers or on their cell phones, things like that. And we'll be getting into that here a little bit later. But when I think about piloting this and doing a full POC, I like to start with this scope. It's set to all here, none here. So really diving into the MDM side of things where you can wipe a device, where you could go ahead and apply applications, policy configuration. If a user is just in MAM scope, you're not able to do those things, but still protect and wipe just that corporate data on this device. The key point I would make here is that essentially if you have this set to all, both of these scopes set to all, you have the MAM scope taking precedence over the MDM scope. And you'll get that better idea of what I mean when I say that over time, but essentially if a user logs in on a personal device to a particular 365 application like Teams, if you've set both of these to all, it's not going to enroll them in the MDM solution. It's only going to do the MAM policy because it detects it as a personal device in that particular case. So we'll get more into that later, but it's just important to note that those settings are configured appropriately. You also want to do some CNAME validation. There's CNAME records if you go under the domain section of the 365 admin portal, specifically for enterprise mobility and security. And this is something that I always use as part of a checklist just to make sure my DNS records are updated with those two CNAME records that they give you. The final piece, I'll get into the deployment program here from that standpoint of management and configuration. But the other pieces here, if you do plan on enrolling other platforms into the service like iOS and Android, there are some prerequisites that you have to do here. One of which is getting an Apple MDM push certificate, which I've alluded to in a previous video you can check out. And essentially you would need one of these for every single company that you manage. So a new certificate, a new management portal, because it should be unique to that company. And those certificates expire every 365 days. So that's just something you have to keep up with, but it is a prerequisite to enrolling any type of iOS or macOS device into the service. Android enrollment is very similar, where you would want to have a business account for the Google Play Store so that they can connect applications and things like that, and you can link them here for them in that particular admin environment. And that's something that you can configure and link to this platform as well too. I've done other videos about that you can check out on my Intune playlist. So just keeping in mind, we just want to do really high level today. Last piece here, the enrollment restrictions is something that you can configure. If you go under properties, you have the ability to decide what platforms you're going to support or if they're corporate or personal. So saying something like, I don't ever want to support an Android device, and not allowing any Android device to enroll into the service itself. The same thing could be said if you just want to enroll devices that are labeled as corporate versus devices that are labeled as personal. And I won't get into so much depth on that today, but at a very high level, corporate devices are ones that you get from a bulk enrollment program like the Autopilot service if you're getting your devices from an OEM provider like HP or Lenovo or Dell. And then on the Apple side of the house, a DEM provider that's giving you bulk devices that you have serial IDs for and things of that nature. Additionally, you could have them labeled as corporate if you've hybrid joined them to Azure AD and enroll them into Intune via group policy. If you want to say that I don't want to allow personally owned devices, you could block them so that nobody's enrolling into the management for their personally owned devices. This would not stop a person, if you have the MAM policy set up, from enrolling it into that service as well, though, just to point that out. So those are the main high-level configurations from an admin standpoint. Next, let's go ahead and get into policy and configuration. So here on this page, you have the ability to select certain platforms, but all of them are fundamental in that they have some of the same things as you can do for each platform. Fundamentally, though, you always want to set up a compliance policy for every single platform that you support, just so that you can see if they're meeting corporate standards. And this is ultimately also what you could show if you have HIPAA customers or FINRA customers that need to meet certain compliance requirements for how corporate data is managed within that particular company. So here we can create a policy, we can have it set to Windows 10 and later. And when we create this, I'm just going to call this test. And under these settings, you have these high-level buckets, but you're basically defining what makes that a healthy device or in a compliant state. These could include things like you see here where we're requiring BitLocker. They could include additional security parameters or settings to be enabled on the device or in the manner of mobile devices like iOS and Android, and could include things like password requirements, like a secure requirement that's over a certain number of characters or things like that. After you get through those, though, you have fundamentally the same concept here in that you have to decide the action for non-compliant, whether that's immediately or you allow for grace period, say 3 days before this device is marked as non-compliant. Where that comes into play more, I feel like, is where you couple this compliance policy with a conditional access policy that says, hey, if this device is not in a compliant state, we want to not allow access to any of the Office applications. So what I would recommend is that whenever you onboard into a client environment, you don't set up that conditional access policy initially. You get all your devices into a compliant state. And then after that, if they do fall into non-compliance, that is where you want to enforce that particular policy. So just want to be careful about that. If you are enrolling other devices before you hand them off, obviously you want to give them a compliant device in that sense. So with all of these, you'll see this as a theme too. We always get to decide the scope or the actual assignments of users or groups or devices to these particular policies. So in this case, I can add all users and exclude some of the groups out of those, or just add all users or groups or devices. It's really granular in that regard to what I get to do. And then you go ahead and create that policy, and as you apply it to people, you have the ability to see device status, user status, and all of that here, and you can granularly customize it at any point in time too. The devices are syncing into the Intune service, and when they do, if you've updated that policy, it'll look at any new configuration you may have placed there. The other piece here is the configuration profiles. So you can think of this like if you want to decide that you want to have certain device restrictions on a particular platform, or in the case of Windows, if you want to go ahead and push out VPN profiles or Wi-Fi profiles so that the user doesn't have to do that. All of that is customizable here. They have a lot of templates you can work from, and there's documentation on all of these. I've done some videos on some of these just in more depth, but one of the ones I'll point out here too is these administrative templates. This does allow you to configure something that is more familiar in the sense that it is looking at it like group policy. And so you have the ability to customize certain ADMX templates and apply them to computers or users within the environment and scope them just as you normally would here. The other piece to that I'll just mention while we're on the topic is that you do also have the ability to run a tool, the MMAT tool, on your local group policy environment in local Active Directory to see if your policies that you have in place now are MDM compatible. So this gives you a good idea of kind of your roadmap and also the lift in thinking of moving from Active Directory local group policy into Microsoft Intune and Azure AD fully. So just keep those things in mind. With that, the final piece on this section is the PowerShell scripts. So it's looking at being able to deploy a PowerShell script, much like you're familiar with if you're using an RMM tool today. But essentially here, you can just add a PS1 file, or you could define the script location, and you can then run the script using the logged in credentials, or do all these other things like make sure it's running in 64-bit version and things of that nature. So this is really straightforward in that regard if you've already been using PowerShell scripts today. The next thing here is just related to patches, and that's what they call Windows 10 update rings in the case of Microsoft here. So you can create profiles and you can go ahead and call it whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you're just defining the update channels that a particular device is going to be using, in addition to any delays or deferral periods or stuff like that. Again, if you're using an RMM tool today, you're very familiar with this in that sense. And it could be that you have a line of business application that needs deferral or something like that. And that's all customizable and granular from this level as well. So all of that can be assigned to all users, or if you want to scope that to different users and groups, you can as well. The next section here that I want to cover is applications and application management. So in this particular section, you have this all apps section, which you can see all the applications that you've pushed out. And this includes applications you can push out to Android, iOS, Windows, Mac OS devices. When you click on add here, you can select an app type. They have a lot of different options here for the particular platforms, Most notably, though, you have your Office 365 apps like the Office Suite and Teams that you can automatically push out to devices that are pre-configured. In addition to that, you have the ability to push out custom Win32 apps, line of business applications. A lot of the MSPs that I work with on this are using it to push out their RMM tool. In the case of leveraging Autopilot to get a device from an OEM provider, making sure that they have all the necessary policies and configurations. And then when that user boots that up, they automatically have the RMM agent installed as well too, because they're not at a state where we're fully adopting Intune for everything. It's just not going to be there yet until I think Lighthouse gets a little bit more built out. But additionally, they also have an Intune wrapper so that you can wrap custom exe or MSI files as well too that you may want to add, like your endpoint protection software or something like that, and that you can deploy. So in the case of Windows 10 and 365 apps, I just want to take a look real quick and point out on this Configure App Suite section, they have this configuration designer format, and this is something where I only push this one out via a client that has enterprise applications, so E3 or E5 plan. In the case of business plan, I'd like to do the custom XML data and use the Office customization tool to create this XML file because it relates to the business apps versus the enterprise apps from Microsoft. So just keep that in mind. It's a good tip while you're doing that, something I learned along the way. So that's everything from the standpoint of pushing out your own applications, but they also want to point out the app protection policies, and this is really powerful, and this comes back to our conversation of mobile application management, or MAM, that I mentioned earlier, where you can actually assign policies to devices that you don't necessarily manage in the MDM solution, but provide you a little bit more granular policy control over how they're interacting with those applications. So in this particular case, I'm looking at setting up a policy for a computer without enrollment. Not saying that I don't want it in the MDM solution, but this may be their personal laptop, for instance. I can add protected applications here, and it comes built out of the box with all of Microsoft's applications, but you could also add a custom product as well too that you say is a defined managed corporate location. A good example of that would be something like Dropbox. And so essentially with this policy is you're saying that I want to lock down, cut, copy, paste, and I also want to lock down save as permissions for all the documents that may be stored in here and things of that nature, and even communications just in Teams to only other managed applications, like being able to take, if you did set up Dropbox, take Teams files and share them into that Dropbox environment. Otherwise, the end user would get a message that says that you can't do this. It's not allowed in your organization because this isn't a managed location for you. So all those things are good to keep in mind. And for these settings, I go in granular depth on all of this in other videos, but essentially here, block is obviously going to be the most restrictive permission where you get that message that says you can't do this. But initially when you're rolling this out, you could say allow override so the user could move past that, or a silent protection where you're just getting log files to see how many times this is actually happening within the organization, so you can understand a little bit better about scope of user impact through doing these things. You have these advanced settings here, and I'm not going to go through this just because I've done it in previous videos, but one of my favorites here is this enterprise data protection icon you can set up, which actually gives a visual indicator on some of the applications like Teams, for instance, so that people can see that and know that that application is actually protected, and they have a little bit more of an awareness of being better in the sense of not sharing that data and thinking more about where they share that data. If it's going into a Gmail account or something like that, they're going to be immediately shut down in those cases. So those are things that I like to show here. The only separation in a sense of iOS and Android that you didn't see there on that page is with those, you actually get to have the autonomy to, one, disable it from backup to iCloud. So don't allow, Teams data or anything like that to be backed up to their personal iCloud. And additionally, you could set a PIN for security so that even if they did lose their phone or it's stolen, they still have an additional security layer at the application layer itself. So saying I'm going to Teams, I have to put it in a 4-digit PIN before I can access that data. You can additionally then selectively wipe that data at any point in time from these devices that have enrolled, quote unquote, into the MAM service. And so that's another big thing to keep in mind when you think about a long-term rollout. I like to start with MDM and make sure I have all my corporate devices enrolled there, locked down, no personal devices, BYOD, and then slowly move my way into, okay, great, now that we're set up here, we're really strong, and from our security perspective, now I can get into the application management policies here so you guys can have more flexibility on accessing your corporate data from your cell phone, for instance. So all those things are pieces that I wanted to mention. The last section here, I'll just speak to enrollment in general and give you a couple of ideas of what that would look like. So the most powerful experience, again, is Microsoft Autopilot. And so I left this for last just because it encompasses kind of how you would actually enroll devices on a bulk scale in a lot of way. You can work with your OEM provider to gather a CSV that you upload here, which includes all the serial and hardware IDs. This gives you the autonomy and flexibility to assign those devices to users straight from this section. And then you could take those devices and you can assign them to your compliance policies, your applications, all of that, so that when you ship it to the user, they get that experience that we've kind of molded up to this point, which is the custom branding, the terms and conditions, the friendly messaging with their name on it, saying, hey, welcome to Contoso, Sam, and then you walk through and it deploys all your applications and everything like that, so they're straight from box to production in a matter of minutes. And again, you didn't have to ultimately touch that device. You could have just ordered it through the OEM provider and shipped it direct to consumer. So that's a really powerful part of that exposure. You do want to set up these device deployment profiles though for Windows, and this basically is defining that out of the box experience. So without that, this really wouldn't work, but I'm going to go ahead and just put test here. The other cool part here that I'll just mention before I get into it further is that bulk enrollment method that is probably going to be most popular is doing a hybrid Azure AD join of your devices into the Azure Active Directory environment so that you can take all your on-prem devices, join them up to the cloud in a hybrid fashion, and then you can use a GPO to enroll them all into Intune. There's not really any downside to this unless you've inadvertently put in compliance policies that would disrupt the user. GPOs or Intune configuration profiles can be set as far as what takes priority if there's a conflict, and you can set that, and I'm not going to go through that in this video, but just know that that's a possibility. But where this comes into play though, where this is cool, is that you could take all those devices and convert them all into the Autopilot service. Autopilot does allow you to do a factory reset, so that if you have employee churn, you could just reset that device back to factory state and reconfigure it to push out new apps and new configuration profiles to a new employee versus having to do that manually yourself. It does allow you just to fold it back into this powerful service here. So in this particular case, you could decide if they're Azure AD joined or hybrid joined. And this is the case where, again, I think a lot of you would gravitate towards as we continue to migrate our customers from on-prem Active Directory into this fully managed solution in the cloud. The last piece here is the white glove experience. So this is giving you the flexibility as a technician to get that device, configure, let the apps install, configure granular settings that maybe you don't have access to do within the Intune portal before you close that back down, hand it off to the end user so that they get an even better experience when they boot up that device. And then the same thing is true with assigning this to users and things of that nature. The other enrollment methods that you can use here kind of relate to just signing into applications on your particular desktop or even on your cell phone or iOS, Android device. So whenever you do that, you're going to get a prompt that, this device looks like it needs to be under management. And if you've configured your settings in the sense of just having an MDM enrolled, they'll enroll fully into the service and you'll have full management over that device. Otherwise, they're just going to have the MAM policy configured for protection on that device as well. So there's a couple different ways, but if you think about solely bulk deployment, you're either going to, number one, harvest a serial ID from the device via PowerShell and upload it into the Autopilot service, or most likely you're going to be configuring the hybrid Azure AD join with all your local domain join devices and pushing a GPO to automatically enroll them into Intune. But I will be making a subsequent video here that kind of shows you how to do the hybrid join plus group policy enrollment method, which I consider to be the most attractive when you think about a holistic rollout. But I would recommend also that you check out my video on the Intune hybrid deployment method so that you see kind of more of a visual diagram of everything that I'm kind of referring to as you slowly move devices into Intune management as well. That's everything that I wanted to showcase for you guys in this video. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, like or subscribe if you want to see more content around Microsoft 365 and the MSP space. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.